Hello, BookTube. We are doing Bookshelf Essentials. This is a video concept created by David Wiley over on his channel. I keep forgetting to leave a link to his channel, but you should all go and subscribe. That he meant to doff the hat to the fact of the reality that I believe is true for all of us, that when you look around your bookshelves, I am on the fainting couch right now because the temperature in Boston is grudgingly inching upwards. So suddenly this corner in between two banks of windows is no longer Arctic. And from where I'm sitting, I'm looking at a great many books on shelves. We all have that. And when you look at those books, they didn't all get there the same way. Some of them were long studied and meditated purchases. Some of them were inherited or gifts from treasured people. Others were the product of impulse. So the reaction that they have, the Marie Kondo sparking of joy that they provoke when you look at them, is different, volume by volume. What David Wiley wants to do with this series of videos is isolate the books that are special, the ones that are essential, the ones that really jump out at you. I have quite a few of those. Of course, my goal, like any bookish person, is for all of my collection to be that and nothing else. I'm not there by a long shot. I'm staying closer to that goal in this last week than I usually do because this last week has been bitterly cold, freezing cold. And when it's freezing cold, I don't want to go and stand outside like Brown's cows, freezing my giblets off in the sale lot of the Brattle Bookshop. So I haven't added a lot of books, is what I'm saying, aside from the stuff that publishers send. I'm not going to send anything on a bleak and barren Sunday. There's no mail that's going to come today, except the Sunday New York Times. So I thought I'd do another bookshelf essential. And this one, well, this one's been essential for a long time. This is a lot of my bookshelf essentials are classics, including Penguin classics. The reprint line of Black Spine Penguin classics that I love so much, and I have loved them for so long and used them so much and reread them so much. Even when it's a Penguin classic of a work I can read without a translator. There's something about the whole world of the Penguin classic line of translations that I still love. I love them anyway. I love them for the different voices. It's like, what would be the way to describe it? You have a historical character in mind. King Edward, the great King Edward. I guess I should. The Edwards did. The English did really well by their Edwards. I should probably clarify. I mean Edward III. I have Edward III in my mind, but I will get a very different Edward III if somebody were to write a great play about Edward III, and you were to give the lead role to 4 different lead actors. I would get 4 different Edwards. I might still love the original biography, the primary source biography they were all drawn from, but I will very much also like those different Edwards. I will want to think about them. It's the same thing with translations, sometimes of authors that I know really well without a translator. I still want to know what the translator is doing. I find that fascinating. That has always been a linchpin of why I love Penguin Classics the way I do. We're going to do a Penguin Classic today, but we won't stick to Penguin Classic because I want to show you another translation as well. And the book is the Decameron by Boccaccio, who was born in 1313. He was the illegitimate, he was born probably just outside of Florence, one afternoon's pony ride away from Florence. I always hesitate to say, I mean, it's pretty certain that we know the little town that is now part of Greater Florence that he was born in, and not in Florence itself. I don't know that I 100% think that that's all that important in this particular case. If you only know Boccaccio from the Decameron, you might not, and if you don't know Italy, then you might not care, or you might not notice. But there's scarcely a more Florentine author that you could pick here. Right? Is he a genius? Yes. Can he handle himself in the high intellectual debates in the church, but also knows all the latest dockyard jokes? Yes. Is he fun to be around, both in person and on the page? Yes. Well, okay. So, all right. So Sertaldo or not, I say that he is a Florentine writer, of course, and he was born to a man, a loving, gregarious father that we can just call Boccaccio. So effectively, they were the same name, but his father's name was Boccaccio, and uh, his father quickly legitimized him. He was born illegitimate, but his father welcomed him with open arms and made him a legitimate son. And his father was, for the bulk of the time that we have to concern ourselves with him, he was a banker, including with the Bardi family that did a lot of business, not only in Italy, but also with the aforementioned Edward III. Now, I don't know, maybe that was why he was on my mind. They did a lot of business in England. A lot of famous English stuff, famous English events that are in histories of England were financed from Florence. And Boccaccio was in that line of work. He was a banker, and he expected, as every well-to-do father did at the time, that his son would follow in his footsteps. And bless him, Boccaccio tried. He tried, and he didn't try the way some literary figures in later centuries try, where, oh, you want me to go into banking? I guess I'll try that, much to the harrow of my immortal soul. And 6 months later, they're at Oxford. No, Boccaccio tried for years, and I don't think he was any good at it. I don't think we'll ever really have the facts to know whether or not he was any good at it, but he certainly didn't like it. He knew that it wasn't for him. He was head over heels in love with literature from a very early age, and certainly by the time his father moved and took on a bigger job at a Bardi banking institution and brought Boccaccio along and got him a desk. Certainly by that point, Boccaccio was absolutely besotted with literature, including, most of all, his beloved Dante. The author meant more to him than anybody. Even, I would argue, Petrarch. It was just clear that it wasn't going to work, and eventually accommodations were made, and Boccaccio started to do a lot more literary stuff. He was an extremely prolific author. We don't think that today, because we know him only from this book. The Decameron used to be taught in schools, and maybe is taught in schools in less religious countries than America. Countries that have more freedom in academia. America has almost no freedom in academia. So, if you live in a free country, this is probably still taught in literature classes. Parts of it are. This is a framework. This is a framework compendium of what many early translators have referred to as novels. The framework will be familiar to you probably if you encountered this in school. The city of Florence is struck by the Great Plague, and anyone who can leaves. Anyone who can leave the city does. And in the heart of the story is a group of Florentines who they are able to leave, so they go for, to quote the title of a much later pastiche, 10 days in the hills. They go into the countryside for 10 days, and they decide to amuse themselves among many other ways. They play music and do all sorts of other things, but they also tell stories for 10 days, 10 stories a day. And they rotate between them, and we get, as a result, a bewildering number of little plots. We wouldn't call them novels now because we're accustomed to novels having a length over 120 pages, something like that. But certainly centuries of writers have just mined the Decameron for novels. You take pretty much any story that's in the Decameron and invest it with the kind of psychology and interiority and amplitude of detail that we expect in our fiction now, and you will easily get it to 60,000 words. So I see the reasoning behind it, and this book is the thing we know Boccaccio for. But he kept on writing. He also did a series of public lectures on Dante, on the work of Dante. People often ask me when they know that I'm enamored of history and the history of literature. They often ask me, "Wouldn't you love to be, in Plato's Academy or listen to some speech that's delivered during the Peloponnesian War?" I would have loved to hear those lectures by Boccaccio on Dante. That I would have loved to do. This book was almost certainly the urge to pull it together. Boccaccio loved telling stories. Some of the stories that are in here are repurposed from earlier works of his. He loved neat little stories, especially if they could be a good deal of fun, if they could express the amplitude of his native Tuscan rather than the formal Latin of the day, if they could have a ribald element to them, like I mentioned. Florentines are brilliant, adaptable, ribald, funny, fun to be around. You could take the citizens of other major Italian cities will be known for one of those things, or another of those things, or a third of those things. It's only in the Florentines that you get them all, and you get them all the time. So he was interested in all of that, but he was outside of Florence. This was years later when he was an older man. His father was gone. Or his father was old, but his father wasn't gone yet. But his father was, Boccaccio had been booted out of the party banking industry. And that shows you, that tells you something about him, because you could be as corrupt as Satan and still keep your berth at the party banking facility. The one thing you couldn't be is inept. And Boccaccio was that horrifying combination in a banker of genial and incompetent. Take it from me, if you've never had the horrible experience of dealing with such a combination, take it from me. That is a deadly combination. So he wasn't part of the banking industry anymore, and Boccaccio was probably taking care of him. And there were children. Boccaccio had some children of his own that didn't live, and there were hangers-on, family hangers-on. He was a generous guy, and he was out of Florence in 1348. When the plague struck with a savagery that it had never shown before in Italy, and was scarcely ever to show again. It was known. The scourge was known, and what you do with it was known. What can you do? There are all sorts of civic ordinances, some of which would be very familiar to all of us now, since we have lived through a pandemic. Some were more barbaric, we wouldn't countenance them. Maybe we will next time. If the next pandemic is worse, maybe we will. And Boccaccio was familiar with all of that, but the plague that hit Florence in 1348 was off the charts. Whole streets of people dying in one day. Just a gigantic, exaggerated mortality. And probably that brought him to mind of the framing device here, where what if people had to go off into the wilderness, into the idyllic wilderness? The wilderness in the Decameron is partly fantastical. And what if they had to go there and just amuse themselves? It's perfect escapist fiction. It still has a bite to it. It's shot through with the rather virulent misogyny that Boccaccio experienced and expressed for pretty much all of his life and in a lot of his work. But it also has all sorts of topical humor. It's savage against the abuses of the church, for instance. If you might not be familiar with the stories day by day or, person by person here in the Decameron, but if you know anything about some of these stories, you'll know that a lot of them are savagely lampooning the corruption and lasciviousness of the church. You get all of that. That was meant to be pointed but fun humor. This is meant to be, above all, an enjoyable book. But it's a strange one. It's a strange one, and translators have trouble with it, because the overarching framework of the book, the broader narrative of the book, Boccaccio casts in one particular kind of language, one particular level of diction. But he does that, it's extra starchy, and he makes it extra starchy on purpose because he wants to contrast it with the varying voices in the stories, which are amazing. Just amazing. Because it's not just each individual of those 10 people telling these stories, those nobles, or people, those exiles, self-exiles from Florence. It's not just each one of those has a different personality, it's also that when they give their story over to the narration of some new character in the story, often that character's personality will take over the story. So if you're a translator and you're looking at this and thinking, oh my God, you'd be astonished. It's amazing how many times this work has been translated. It has been translated quite a few times, including, this old Penguin translation is by G.H. McWilliam. And G.H. McWilliam, I'm assuming it's a he, points out that a lot of those translations are anonymous, as you would think would probably be true. If you were living in a country or in an age when the church still had huge amounts of power to hurt you, to dispossess you, to punish you, torture you, kill you, if you were seized with a desire to translate this work, you probably wouldn't put your name on it, because there's a lot in here that's extremely explicit, extremely scandalous. You would still translate that stuff, but you would make sure that it was anonymous. There were other translations that weren't anonymous. this translation was done in the 70s, I think, and in the 70s, and I think it's only hardened since then into more or less canon. There was a 1620 translation, a little more than 100 years after Boccaccio was born, that, for instance, for a long time was attributed to the great translator John Florio, and now is not. Now scholarly opinion says it's probably not him. I never know what to make with scholarship for any of the big three, the canonical big three Italian writers. I don't know what to make with the scholarship of most of them, most of what I read of that scholarship. I don't know. I'm certainly no expert, but when I read the 1620 translation of the Decameron, I very much feel that I'm in the presence of Florio. I know his other translations. It very much feels the same thing. I guess it could be another person imitating his style. His translations did really well. But be that as it may, we now don't have to worry about that. We now live in if you're outside of the United States, or outside of certain parts of the United States, you live in a mostly secular world, where the power of the church has been broken. You can't ruin your life by translating this work. So there have been a few. None of them entirely successful, unfortunately. Not to say that they couldn't be successful, although translators tend to say that. It's not to say that they couldn't be successful, but they haven't been. Most of them get into most translators, they see this work and they think, okay, well, the tonal register is changing all over the place. Boccaccio the narrator has his own, but then each of the narrators of the story have their own, and also the characters in the stories have their own. How on earth am I supposed to do this? I will just strike more or less one narrative tone, and that'll be that. Because I'm hoping for a student gig. I'm hoping to get my translation sold in schools, and I can't ask that much of the Little Daffodils. And as a result, when you read the Decameron in English, you will get a sense of the fun and the variety and the scandal. But you won't get, so far in English, you won't get the full sense of what a wonder this thing is to read. Which might make a lot of the armchair tweed-wearing purists among you, let's just use a gentle word, purists, say, well, why bother to read it in translation at all? Just why read it? If you can read it in the original, why read it in translation at all? Well, most of the people listening to me can't read Italian, much less the Italian of the Decameron, much less any of the dialects or the weird slipping and sliding between dialects that goes on in the stories and between the stories and between characters in the stories. And like I said, I am interested in the project of translation, very much so. So I want to know what the translators are doing and also what they're saying. So I thought we'd take a look at what they're saying. What does McWilliam say, for instance, in his translation? We mentioned before in Bookshelf Essentials and in many other videos that I've done that translators will often preemptively excuse themselves, and McWilliam does. He writes this in 1971. He wrote this in Canterbury in 1971. When one considers the problems which the Decameron poses for the would-be translator, it's perhaps surprising that the task has been attempted so often. On the one hand, there are those long, elaborate, beautifully balanced sentences with their trailing clusters of dependent clauses, frequently so arranged as to reproduce the characteristic endecasyllable rhythms of Italian poetry, and employing all the stylistic devices of medieval rhetoric. They were, he says frequently, they were almost always designed to be prose poetry. I've never read a translation of the Decameron that managed to convey that, because most translators, as we're going to see, take a look at, how did he put it? Long, elaborate, beautifully balanced sentences with their trailing clusters of dependent clauses. Most translators have looked at that and said, that's got to go. That's got to go. The freshmen at Purdue aren't going to want to read that. And if you get rid of that, well, then there's no way that you're going to be able to convey, the equivalent of Italian prose poetry. But he goes on. On the other hand, one has a whole series of vivid and racy colloquialisms to be found more especially in the tales that are set in the more humble social milieu of medieval Italy. The variations and complexities of Boccaccio's style and language are limitless, and no translator can ever hope to do them full justice. Says you, Seymour. But like Everest, the Decameron is there. And because it is inconceivable that a truly satisfactory English translation of this great European masterpiece will ever be produced, There will always be someone who is foolhardy enough to attempt the task, even if he is familiar with Dante's somber warning. And here he quotes the first part of Dante's Convivio, where he says that any translation will, his word is imbalance, basically. Imbalance, I think McWilliam uses the word upset. He translated it as upset. It's not imbalance either. It's more almost biological. It's almost more. If it's upset stomach, not upset your mind. It's what Dante means is what would be a word? You'd have to go into medical terminology to get the full feeling of what Dante says any translation will do to its original work. And I don't even know what that would be. Distemper? No, that's not right. There is a word in English. There is a word for any word, anywhere, in any language, from any other language. I just need to know it. Maybe nauseate. Maybe that would be the word. That is closer to what Dante means than upset. Upset is so minor. Dante means that in the Convivio, he means that any act of translation will, I keep wanting to say distemper, that it will disease the original. That you will get a diseased version of the original. And McWilliam just quotes that. But I want to point out, Everest has been scaled. Okay, maybe McWilliam wasn't keeping up with current events, but Everest has been scaled many times by all of its susceptible roots, and this can be too. Although I shouldn't completely criticize this book. Sold like gangbusters for Penguin Classics. Oh my God, the decisions that were made here. McWilliam, he talks about those long trailing dependent clauses, but he manages to try to do them some justice. He still takes too free a hand. As I'm always saying on this channel, I want you to translate what the person reads like on the page. Not what you think a student at Loyola is going to want to read on the page in between bong hits. I want you to translate what's on the page. And if they don't like it, then they don't like Boccaccio. If you serve them up something else, if you take those long, and I mean, we're talking a page at a time sometimes, those long, gorgeous, contrapuntal sentences that weigh and balance and shift and shimmer amongst themselves to the point where you are a third of the way down the page and you're wondering how it's going to end. Not the story, but this sentence. How is this sentence going to end? The author of this sentence was intentionally raising my expectations of what the next 10 clauses were. And they are wrong. Those expectations were wrong. I don't know where I am in this sentence. All I know is that I'm being ineluctably drawn along like a figure walking in a dream. That's a very active part of Boccaccio, so-called Boccaccio, the narrator's parts in the Decameron. If you remove that and if you butcher it into, Americanese, Hemingway, as an earlier commentator put it, what you're serving will certainly be the plot and the action, the shot and incident of the stories of those days in the hills. But there's a case to be made for doing that. A lot of those early translations into English and a whole bunch of other languages were specifically going at just providing the stories. Just give us the stories. And never mind about the filigree. So this, despite what the translator says, he doesn't actually do as much violence to that as he could. And we want to look at one other translation for this bookshelf essential. Sorry for the length. I could go on forever about the stuff that I've been living with for the longest, the classics that I love the most. I could go on forever. We're going to deal with another English language translation. This one's much, much later. It's decades later than McWilliam. It's not Penguin. This is W.W. Norton. This is the Wayne Rebhorn translation. And this is the paperback. The paperback, oh, sorry, I'm blocking the beam. The paperback is definitely the thing you want because it has excellent blurbs. You definitely want that. From Yield Quarterly Conversation. Is the Quarterly Conversation is still in print anymore? Is it still made anymore? It was the intellectual baby of its editor, creator, and main content creator, a guy named Scott Esposito, who I'm pretty sure is now a woman. So I have no idea if the Quarterly Conversation is still around. But I wrote a nice long... I also have no idea if anything that was on the Quarterly Conversation is findable. more importantly. I'm not so much concerned with which part of Walmart the former Scott Esposito shops in, as I am whether or not my imperishable words can still be found online. I don't know the state of that. I did quite a few pieces for Scott, so I don't know if they're findable on the Quarterly Conversation, but one of the reasons that I loved writing pieces for him is because he gave me all the room I wanted for anything. So I wrote a nice long review of Wayne Redhorn's translation. And he also has something to say about what a translator can and cannot do with Boccaccio. I thought we'd read a little of him as well, as long as we're on the subject here. Let's see here. Translating Boccaccio is a challenge, and not just because he writes in a foreign language that is 700 years old, although I do not minimize the difficulties that those things present. That's one thing, but that's okay. Boccaccio is even more of a challenge because he actually writes in several distinct languages, several distinct styles. Most of the narrative portions of his text are written in a very formal prose that is modeled on late medieval Latin. To capture this aspect of his style, I have tried to preserve his long, syntactically complicated sentences, although I have sometimes been forced to break them up in order to ensure that they are readable in English. Who forced you to do that, Seymour? Mussolini? I don't think you were forced to do that. I think you read those things and thought, that's not going to do. Didn't stop Winston Churchill. You could, if you read, anyway, or Macaulay. Anyway, to capture this aspect of his style, I've tried to preserve, in those lengthy sentences, Boccaccio typically connects elements together by means of a host of dependent conjunctions, and even more frequently by using past and present participial constructions, some of which I have retained, but most of which I have felt had to be turned into clauses with active subjects and verbs. They don't have to be. You don't have to do that. Moreover, those participial constructions make the reader work at determining how the various pieces of each sentence fit together, whether one idea precedes or follows another in time or serves as the cause or effect of something else. Exactly. It's exactly what I was talking about. You don't know where you are in some of those sentences. Gorgeously, you don't. Wonderfully, you don't. But he's making it sound bad. I'm sure that he means that it's bad. This has meant that sometimes I have simply broken his sentences apart. Not because they threaten to become overly long, but because I felt I need to sort out temporal and causal sequences for the reader. Moreover, in Boccaccio's aesthetic, it is clearly acceptable to repeat a word or various form of a word within a short space of just a sentence or two. Modern English style demands more variation, and thus, whereas Boccaccio was content to write to love, follow it with a short of beloved, and then speak of lover, I have elected to supply variation, turning amare to love, for instance, sometimes into to fall for or to become enamored of. And he goes on like that for a bit. You want to rage. You want to rage against it. You really do. First of all, to love someone is not to fall for them or to become enamored of them. The reason why you would use those instead of to love someone in a sentence in English is because they mean different things. They connote different things. Oh, what's the matter, baby? Oh. Webhorn's translation aesthetic is bothering even my little bean, who's only fluent in very strident German. What are you doing? So the point I'm trying to make here is twofold. One is that Boccaccio is wonderful, and any English translation that you read, almost any English translation, there's one that McWilliam just rakes over the coals. Who is it that he hates? The Aldington translation, yes, which is still very widespread. You can easily find it in a used bookstore. Finally, we come to the Aldington translation, which has more faults than the servant of Friar Cipolla, and which it would be at kindest to pass over in silence, except for the large number of contemporary English readers. It alone has served as their means of judging Boccaccio's worth. His version of the Decameron is littered with schoolboy errors. It goes on and on. He enumerates a number of those errors. So, on the one hand, I'm saying that Boccaccio is great. And despite what it might seem in this video, I am suggesting that you can very much get a sense of that greatness, even in a couple of English translations. I would leave your choices to these two. rather than go any older, unless you are a fan of booming, rolling Jacobean prose, in which case what I consider to be the Florio translation, the 1620 translation, would still be the one you could get. I'm sure you can get that for free online. On the one hand, I'm saying that this is an author very much worth reading, even in an English language translation, provided A, that it's not making a litany of schoolboy errors, and B, that you get along with it. The important thing about any translation is that you get along with it, even a bad translation. It's important that you get along with it, because a book that you don't read, a book that defeats you or that you throw down in disgust after one page, well, that's not going to hook you at all. Your chances of falling in love with that author, even through the lens of a bad translation, are zero. It's only if you read it that you will fall in love with the author. And then, if you do fall in love with an author through a bad translation, I have known so many people who fell in love with Homer through the Butcher and Lang translation, widely regarded as one of the worst translations ever of any language. I have known people to fall in love with the book that way, and before them in their reading life is only the prospect of incredible wonders as they encounter better and better translations, or maybe take the bull by the horns and learn the original, learn the language. You can fall in love with Boccaccio in this volume. I've had students do that. And you can also fall in love with Boccaccio in this volume too. Wayne Rebhorn is trying his hardest to accommodate that incredible shifting of style and voice that I mentioned earlier on. He's trying his hardest to do that. He's trying harder than McWilliam is. So it's possible in either of these to fall in love with Boccaccio. That's one of the things I'm saying. The other thing I'm saying is that it's well worth it. It's well worth it to do. This is Boccaccio's Decameron, needless to say, is definitely a bookshelf essential of mine. So that's sorry, that's a very long, roundabout, very digressive video. I'll try to pick something that is not translated tomorrow, so that we can do this in shorter order. But I do want to recommend the Decameron. I know that it's as out of fashion now as it possibly could be. Probably it is being quietly dropped from the curricula of so many schools that have been ideologically captured. I'm sure that is the case. There is no concept in most of these stories. There is no concept of the modern idea of sexual consent. There's no concept in most of these stories of any modern conception of interpersonal cruelty. A lot of these stories, the modern sensibility would consider to be incredibly coarse, not just in terms of the sexual stuff, but in terms of a lot of other stuff too. A lot of characters lie to other characters in ways that today, in our trauma-happy society, we would say are traumatic or traumatizing. It takes a bit of cinching the belt buckle in order to read this book in the hypersensitive 21st century, and as a result, I don't think students will be asked to do it. I just don't think they will. They'll get references to Boccaccio probably, but I doubt they'll be assigned to read the Decameron. I'd be very well. Actually, those of you who are in undergraduates at any level in American schools, have you been assigned the Decameron? I'm just be curious to know if that's the case. That'll be the proof of the pudding right there. And that's a shame, because if that interest goes away, probably the mainstream interest in frequently translating this work will also go away. And as I've kind of made clear in this video, we could do with an adventurous translation of this work, more adventurous than either one of these. We could do with that. We do with the translator, to use the odious verb in the 21st century, leaning in to the stylistic and rhetorical variation that both of these translators have mentioned, that I mentioned. So far, we have not had a translator do that. You would have to take stylistic liberties to do that. Not as many as a lot of translators take without giving you the benefit of that experimentation. I do understand why. I don't like the fact that the 21st century, most canonical translations that come out from major publishers and get reviewed in the New York Times or the New York Review of Books or whatever, the reason for their existence is stylistic experimentation on the part of the translator, but it's to hate men. Only. It's to come out with a Beowulf or an Iliad or whatever that hates men. Well, okay. All right. So you as a publisher have proven that you're okay with a stylistically adventurous translation of an ancient work. All right, fine. How about instead of stupid Twitter politics. You commission someone or accept someone who wants to do a daring translation of this work. An English translation that we have not seen yet of the Decameron, which would be great to see. But anyway, I don't want to veer. I don't want to get into more digressions that will make this video even longer. Good Lord. Bookshelf Essential videos are not supposed to be this long. Mine will not be. So I will wrap this up for now. Good Lord. Blame David Wiley. But I'll be back with a shorter video next time. Thank you, BookTube.